Hey everybody, and welcome. This is session 4 of my series, Acting Like Saul, but Becoming Like David. That's what we aim to do because David chose very well. When he did make a mistake or he sinned, he got on the right track. And we're going to see what happens today as we look at Saul chasing after David and David on the run. David is going to be doing having some cave time. We want to dig in and see what he does under emotional stress. Think about the crises that you face in your life and think about how you typically respond. Do you run and hide? Do you face it head on? Do you seek God? Do you seek others? Do you talk on and on about it? Do you get very quiet about it? Do you cry? Do you rail? Do you write? Do you get angry? What do you do? And we're going to see what David does and what we can learn. Now let's go back and review a little bit about David and what we've learned about him and Saul. Last week we learned, a few weeks ago, we actually learned about him being a shepherd. And we learned that when it was time for Samuel to look for a king, he went to Jesse's home, and David was the last pick of all the brothers, the 8 brothers, but God took notice of him. We also learned that David played the harp. He played it for Saul and was able to get into his chambers and learn about Saul and learn about the role of king. God had appointed David king, but he was not ruling yet. Then we learned that David had a famous victory over the giant named Goliath in this war against the Philistines. And then in the chapters that we're going to look at today, we see that Saul is getting increasingly jealous of this young man who started out as a simple shepherd and has now become a very famous young man in Saul's court. So let's see how Saul's jealousy increases as David's faith is tested. Let's notice what David does on the run from Saul. We're going to dig into some lessons from Saul on the run. From David on the run. The first one is you can trust God in times of peace. When David was young, he spent hours alone with God as he was shepherding. He learned to talk to God and he learned to rely fully on God for protection. This served him well when he was threatened by the Israelites. David responded with confidence, not in his own abilities, but in God. And that's what we should do as well. Press into God by praying and studying the Bible and putting into practice what it says before trouble strikes. That's what David did. We're in this situation now where Saul wants to capitalize on David's success by bringing him into his house and making him part of his army. So we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 18. After David had finished talking with Saul, he met Jonathan, the king's son. There was an immediate bond between them, for Jonathan loved David. From that day on, Saul kept David with him and wouldn't let him return home. And Jonathan made a solemn pact with David because he loved him as he loved himself. Jonathan sealed the pact by taking off his robe and giving it to David, together with his tunic, sword, bow, and belt. Whatever Saul asked David to do, David did it successfully. So Saul made him a commander over the men of war, an appointment that was welcomed by the people and Saul's officers alike. When David met Jonathan, this is now after he has slayed Goliath, and Saul's recognizing that David is going to be very useful for him. Jonathan and David became very close friends. Their friendship is one of the deepest and closest described in Scripture, and it was one that was based on commitment to God. Saul wants to bring David in, and he wants to impress other people by having David there, but this all backfires because the people are more impressed with David than they are with Saul. Look at what we read in verse 6. When the victorious Israelite army was returning home after David had killed the Philistine, women from all the towns of Israel came out to meet King Saul. They sang and danced for joy with tambourines and cymbals. This was their song. Saul has killed his thousands and David his 10,000s. Well, that made Saul very angry. What's this, he said. They credit David with 10,000 and me with only thousands. Next, they'll be making him their king. Is that not the height of irony? Because Saul doesn't know that David has been anointed by God as the next king. So from that time on, Saul kept a jealous eye on David. See, Saul's appreciation for David turned quickly to jealousy once David began to get attention. David's success was not his own doing, but it was what came from the Lord. But Saul didn't care about the Lord. He didn't see it that way, and he didn't care to recognize those that God was blessing. Rather, Saul has become irrational and fearful. Saul has flipped. He's making emotional decisions instead of rational ones. I'm sure had I been around during that time and been given the privilege, I would have tried to coach him down. You know how I tend to do that. But Saul is a narcissist. He's self-centric, and he ruled through pride and fear. And at that point, he was not coachable. He was not teachable. And we see that his mental decline made him very unstable in his household. And as no one knew from moment to moment what he was going to do. Rather than rejoicing in David's success, he wanted to see David killed. We move to verse 10. The very next day, a tormenting spirit from God overwhelmed Saul, and he began to rave in his house like a madman. David was playing the harp as he did each day, but Saul had a spear in his hand, and he suddenly hurled it at David, intending to pin him to the wall. But David escaped him twice. Saul was then afraid of David, for the Lord was with David and had turned away from Saul. Saul tried to kill David 2 times in this one episode because he was jealous of David's popularity. Now, David was a man who was greatly loved. He was loved by the people. He was loved by Saul's son. He was loved by Saul's daughter, as a matter of fact, and all the people. Yet, despite Saul's attacks on David, he continued to protect and comfort Saul. Perhaps people have been jealous of you, or maybe have attacked you on different levels, much like Saul was attacking David. They may have been intimidated by something about you that made them self-conscious of their own shortcomings. And what would be natural is to strike back at those people and to avoid them. But what we know is it's better to befriend them. So a reminder is to ask God to open up a door of opportunity for friendship with those who try to attack us. My father always taught us to do that as kids. He taught us to take those who would strive against us, who would want to be our enemies, and find a way to bring them onto our side and to be kind to them. And that has stayed with me. It's very important to reach out to others and try to bring them in instead of repel them and push them away. Saul did not get that lesson, did he? Because what was happening with Saul was he was letting jealousy have a foothold in his life. Well, that failed. So he tried to win David over this time by giving him his daughter in marriage. Now, if you remember, think back to the promise for anyone who would fight Goliath was that person got to marry Saul's daughter. And so this is what is supposed to happen. But it takes an interesting twist. We see in verse 17, one day Saul said to David, I'm ready to give you my older daughter, Merab, as your wife. But first you must prove yourself to be a real warrior by fighting the Lord's battles. Be a real warrior, he said. Prove yourself. For Saul thought, I'll send him out against the Philistines and let them kill him rather than doing it myself. You see, he had an ulterior motive. And so he wants to give the daughter so that David will then be a part of his family. And then he can sort of, make have a relationship with him where David kind of owes him something. Well, that's not going to work out well. His real motive is wrong to have David marry the daughter. He knew that David would do anything to please Saul. And so he's kind of maneuvering him, isn't he? And that's not a good thing. Well, in the meantime, Saul plans a wedding. David comes home for the wedding, but the deceitful Saul gave his daughter Merab to another man. Okay, how's that for a man that doesn't keep his promises? So, in the meantime there, we have another daughter whose name is Michal. She fell in love with David. Well, the king learned of this, and he decided it would be a good idea to go ahead and give this daughter, Michal, to David in order that she could become a snare for him and that she could help Saul to turn on David. Well, it wasn't long before David realized Michal really loved David. She was not going to be any part of his conspiracy against her husband that she had come to love. Well, the king gets furious about that. And from that point on, his total wrath was vented on David. So do you see how he is trying to manufacture, maneuver, and control emotions and the relationships within his own family? The majority of the remainder of his life was spent chasing David. And he avowed that his purpose now was to kill David. David now realizes that Saul is after him. Jonathan warns David of what is happening, and his wife Michal also warned David. They both protected David. They listened to him, and he was faithful to them and listened to them. They helped him. So our second tip for living like David is to receive counsel from trusted friends. When trouble comes, we don't always think straight, do we? We get a lot of information. Heartache has set in, disappointment, devastation, whatever it is, and we don't think straight. It's good to let the godly friends come alongside and give us some wise counsel. Let's look at 1 Samuel 19, verse 18. This is what David decided to do. So David escaped and went to Ramah to see Samuel, and he told him all that Saul had done to him. Then Samuel took David with him to live at Naioth. Well, our third strategy is to establish boundaries around evil. We set boundaries around the wrongdoing and around evil people and evil when we do what David was doing. He put on his whole armor. He surrounded himself by faithful people, righteous people. He set healthy boundaries in his toxic relationships, and he would guard his mind against evil by knowing and understanding God's Word and writing those beautiful songs, those hymns of praise and reflection. He would spend time in prayer, and he would do some doing, and he would do some being. He would do things for others. He would work hard, and he would have time to be just with God. We could really learn some lessons when the world is noisy and there is a drumbeat of negativity, and social media and media are helping us to decline mentally and emotionally. we would also do well to do as David did, and set those healthy boundaries against the evil and negative things that come into our mind. Well, beginning in 1 Samuel 22, we find Samuel left Gath, where the land of the giants, and escaped to the cave of Adullam. Well, this is where David is going to spend some time as he is finding a new home and cave life. David had been through a lot by now. He had the high of immediate fame. He had had a recent marriage. He had faced dangers from the Philistines. He had had repeated attempts on his life. And he had a heartbreak farewell from his everyday, normal, routine life to now life as a fugitive for who knew how long. He didn't know how long it was going to be. Well, the cave of Adullam was David's place of refuge. He couldn't go back to his house. He couldn't go to the palace. He couldn't go back to Samuel. He couldn't go to Jonathan. He couldn't go to the temple, to the house of the Lord. And he certainly couldn't go to the ungodly. But Adullam was a place of refuge. That's what the word means in Hebrew, refuge. The cave wasn't to be David's only place of refuge. God wanted to be David's full refuge in this discouraging time. Let's look at 1 Samuel 22. When his brothers and others associated with his family heard where he was, they came down and joined him. Now, David has had to hole up in this cave. The caves in Israel could be quite large, and there were many of them up in the mountains. And so as he was hiding out, fearing his life, and spending time in meditation and prayer and writing his hymns and songs and playing beautiful music, I'm sure he was calling out to God in torment and asking him to send help. And the family came. This was really nice. Now, remember those brothers who had ridiculed David so badly? Those big brothers of his. And remember, his daddy had pretty much dismissed him as a candidate for king. But it's a good thing that during this time, they joined him. It's not too late to have a brotherhood come together. It's not too late to have a reunion of family, is it? They rallied around him. Not only that, but look who else goes to see him. But all who were down on their luck came around. Losers and vagrants and misfits of all sorts. And David became their leader. There were about 400 in all. Now look at this group that's come. Many were in distress. Their lives had not been easy. They had problems of their own, but God had called them to go to David, to the cave at Adullam. There were many who were in debt. They hadn't seen much success in the past, and they were stung from their past failures, and they had problems of their own, but God sent them to David. And then there were those discontented men. That Hebrew word for discontented is bitter of soul. They knew the bitterness of life, and they were not satisfied with their lives, and they were not satisfied with King Saul. They wanted something different. They wanted hope. They wanted something better, and God called them to go to David in the cave. Isn't that wonderful that David was able to minister to all of those who came? Our tip 4 is turn your pain into a purpose. God allowed David to be useful in his pain. These 400 came to David in the cave, and he was able to motivate them and lead them. And you know, eventually this group formed the core of David's military leadership. 400 the first time, and then he had 600, and then thousands began to come. God can use us in the good times and in the hard times if we are willing. We too can turn our pain into purpose, and we can pour into others even though we are having a painful time ourselves. We read in 1 Samuel 22 verse 4, Grant asylum to my father and mother until I find out what God has planned for me." David left his parents in the care of the king of Moab. They stayed there all through the time that David was hiding out. So his father Jesse and his mother, we don't hear anything about his mother. He had one, and he was clearly taking care of his parents during his time of distress. Saul learns about what's going on now. He learns that David has a support team. And so he begins to quiz these people. He begins to find out and dig in and learn what is going on. See, he is so self-centric, and he is filled with such paranoia, and he begins to learn what has happened to David as he has had a life on the run and life in the cave. He learns from a man named Doeg, it's D-O-E-G, that David had been given supplies by the priest. Now, this was a tricky little situation that David went through. David had accepted some holy bread from Ahimelech. Now, accepting holy bread and not being a priest was against the law. So, fearing a conspiracy among David, Jonathan, and the priests, Saul acted. He thought they were all in cahoots together because David had had a misstep. He had sinned. He did something wrong. Saul misinterpreted it and said they are all in something together, and he ordered the killing. He ordered his guards to kill 85 innocent priests because of their support for David. What a wicked and vile man Saul has become. David could not do anything about the priests who were murdered, but he did confess his guilt. He took the matter to the Lord, and he sought forgiveness to the Lord. See, even David on the run made mistakes. He used poor judgment. Out of desperation, he accepted bread that he should not have accepted. And that caused another horrible event. It caused Saul to flip again, lose his mind, and go on a killing rampage of innocent people. David had to own that. And that's our fifth tip: own our mistakes. David sinned. He made mistakes. He had missteps, but he took responsibility for the consequences of his actions. You know, it can be harder when we're undergoing trial to acknowledge sin. But that's what we're called to do, to confess it quickly and then move on. So after consulting God, David confessed and he was able to move forward. See, that's what happens to some people is they don't confess and they just stay mired down in their sin and their mistakes and their guilt and suffering consequences instead of confessing and moving forward. Well, this time David moves on to conquer the Philistines. He and his men now slaughter the Philistines, and Saul learned about it and headed after David once again. So David prayed to God for direction. At every turn, in and out of the caves, going from cave to cave and on the run, David consistently asked God for direction. And this time God sent him into the stronghold of the wilderness in the hill country. Saul hunted, but God kept David hidden. This was the hide and seek game that Saul was playing with David. David would seek God's wisdom, and then God would tell him where to go, and Saul would be on the hunt once again. Well, after a time in the wilderness, God sent him to the stronghold of En-gedi. Our sixth tip is rely on God's leading. Because on the run, David learned to seek God's guidance for every decision. He was a warrior, and he knew how to battle, but he consulted God before committing to action. It can be a gift sometimes when we're thrown off kilter and we get attacked in some kind of a surprising situation, that can absolutely be a gift, because it can throw us right into the arms of God. And that's what happened to David. There was a significant event that occurred when God brought Saul and David together in a cave in the wilderness of En-gedi. I was able to see this a couple of times. All the caves of En-gedi, they are near the Dead Sea. En-gedi is now a nature preserve, and it has beautiful waterfalls and a botanical garden. But there is a significant scene that happens there. We read in 1 Samuel 24, verses 1 and 2, after Saul returned from fighting the Philistines, he was told that David had gone into the wilderness of En-gedi. So Saul chose 3,000 elite troops from all Israel and went to search for David and his men near the rocks of the wild goats. So Saul now is headed in to the cave of En-gedi. He puts himself in a really vulnerable situation when he goes into a cave to relieve himself. Here's where we pick up the story. At the place where the road passes some sheepfolds, Saul went into a cave to relieve himself. But as it happened, David and his men were hiding farther back in that very cave. Awkward. What Saul did not know was that David and his men were there in another part. And David now had an opportunity to kill Saul. And he was encouraged by his men to do so. They say, "Now's your opportunity." David's men were whispering to him, "Today the Lord is telling you, I will certainly put your enemy into your power to do with as you wish." So David crept forward, and he just cut off a piece of the hem of Saul's robe. But then David's conscience began to bother him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this to my lord the king. I shouldn't attack the Lord's anointed one, for the Lord himself has chosen him." So David restrained his men and did not let them kill Saul. And when speaking to Saul directly, here's what he said: "My men wanted me to kill you, but I wouldn't do it. I told them I won't lift a finger against my master. He is God's anointed." You see, David understood that even though Saul was filled with fear and hate, he was still God's chosen king. And only God could remove him from that office. David then declared he would not harm Saul, even though Saul had tried to kill David on numerous occasions. David simply put the matter in the Lord's hands and chose to let God dispense the justice in his own time and in his own way. David goes on to say, "May the Lord judge between us. Perhaps the Lord will punish you for what you are trying to do to me, but I will never harm you." In that encounter, Saul, for a brief moment, recognized his sin and he apologized to David, and then he went home. Then Saul went home, but David and his men went back to their stronghold. You know, that is a reminder of the importance of confession and forgiveness, and how important that is in our relationship with other people, in our relationship with God. It's also a reminder that once we've extended forgiveness, we've made the confession, it does not necessarily mean that the relationship has been rehabilitated and reunited. Because Saul went home, but David did not follow him there. Our tip 7 is maintain integrity and honor. Undergoing our trials is not an excuse for vacating our call to live godly lives. When we are wronged, as David has been, we are tempted to do wrong back to others. Instead, let's rely on God to give us the strength to resist. I really think that David did not return with Saul because he knew Saul would not change. See, as this narcissist, as the one who is totally self-focused, self-centric, he was not going to change. So David goes and visits Samuel, goes and learns about Samuel. This is when Samuel, who was the prophet, who was the one who worked so hard with King Saul and then with David, and now he has died. So let's see what happens now that the prophet who poured into both of these men has gone. Saul again took 3,000 men, and he goes after David to kill him. And again, David was given an advantage where he could kill Saul. So David learns where Saul is. And so we begin to read in verse 7. So David and Abishai entered the encampment by night, and there he was, Saul, stretched out asleep at the center of the camp, his spear stuck in the ground near his head, with Abner and the troops sound asleep on all sides. Abishai said, "This is the moment. God has put your enemy in your grasp. Let me nail him to the ground with this spear. One hit will do it. Believe me, I won't need a second." But David said to Abishai, "Don't you dare hurt him. Who could lay a hand on God's anointed and even think of getting away with it?" And he went on, "As God lives, either God will strike him or his time will come and he'll die in bed or he'll fall in battle. But God forbid that I should lay a finger on God's anointed. Now grab the spear at his head and the water jug and let's get out of here." Well, David took the spear and the water jug that were right beside Saul's head, and they slipped away. Not a soul knew. Nobody. No one woke up. They all slept through the whole thing. Imagine being right there where this huge temptation faced David, and nobody knew. A blanket of deep sleep from God had fallen on all of them. The strongest moral decisions are the ones we make before temptation strikes. David was determined to follow God, and this carried over into every decision he made, even the decision not to murder Saul. Even when men and circumstances seemed to make this a real easy option, David was that loyal to God. Number 8, be an example to others. See, David spares Saul's life, this time before the eyes of a foreigner, Abishai. David's an example of godliness and a reminder that godliness is what inspires him and what he achieves. Others are always watching the lives of Christians. And you know, they especially watch when we're undergoing a trial or a test. Why did David refuse to kill Saul? God had placed Saul in power and had not yet removed him. David did not want to run ahead of God's timing. We saw in situation after situation that Saul was consistently running ahead of God. We are in similar situations when we see that other leaders or government officials are unfaithful, they're incompetent, and it's really easy to criticize and move against leadership. And we also want to be very careful about not running ahead of God and knowing that others are constantly watching us. Well, through all his interactions with Saul, David consistently proved to be the better man. Let's read in 1 Samuel 31 about what becomes of Saul. The army of Philistines fought really hard against the Israelites, and they prevailed. They were in pursuit of King Saul and his sons. Here's what we read. The Philistines caught up with Saul and his sons. They killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons, his 3 sons. The battle was hot and heavy around Saul. The archers got his range and wounded him badly. And Saul said to his weapon bearer, "Draw your sword and put me out of my misery, lest these pagan pigs come and make a game out of killing me." But his weapon bearer wouldn't do it. He was terrified. So Saul took the sword himself and fell on it. When the weapon bearer saw that Saul was dead, he too fell on his sword and died with him. So Saul, his 3 sons, and his weapon bearer, the men closest to him, died together that day. Well, the following day, the Philistines came to the battlefield and found Saul's body and his sons' bodies on the ground. They chopped off Saul's head and stripped his armor off. Then they sent messengers across the land to spread the news of the death of Saul and his 3 sons. Saul faced death the same way he faced life. He took matters in his own hands, didn't he? He didn't think of asking God for guidance. Saul's life and death proved God's concern about Israel having a king had come true. God had warned the Israelites that a king was not the solution. He wanted the prophets to be the ones that guided Israel. And Israel said, "No, give us a king." And God did. And he picked a wonderful, good, righteous man who did not continue to live a righteous life. See, God needed a king that was going to be unlike the kings of other nations. But Saul's life was characterized by inconsistency, disobedience, and self-will. He did not have the heart of God. Well, after Saul's death, all Israel came to David asking him to be their king, saying this, "In time past when Saul was our king, you were the one who really ran the country. Even then, God said to you, 'You will shepherd my people Israel, and you'll be the prince.'" All the leaders of Israel met with King David at Hebron, and the king made a treaty with them in the presence of God. And so they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king and ruled for 40 years. David's life on the run was hard, but God promised him that he would be king over all of Israel, and that promise was fulfilled. Israel was going to end up being divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and that would be within 75 years. But David's dynasty would rule over Judah, the southern kingdom, for 400 years. David was 37 when he finally became king. He was 30 when he finally became king. During the in-between years, he had waited patiently for the fulfillment of God's promise. Our tip number 9, we can experience victory even in trials. David had victories along the way. As the trials continued, he still had little victories. He didn't succumb to this idea that nothing was going to be right until the very end, till he could get the big prize. He would look for small victories and celebrate and sing and write about those and praise the Lord for all the little things that happened in the meantime, in the in-between time, in the cave time. Sometimes it helps to write like Saul did, like David did. David did that a lot when he had things on his mind. And he would write about all the things God brought him through. David was running with God. Our temptation when we're faced with crises and challenges is to run from God, to hide in the caves without consulting God, to leave our faith on the dusty shelves along with God's Word, instead of running to Him and with Him in our battles as David did. So examine your life now and ask yourself, how do I emotionally cope when faced with a crisis? I'm very much like a Martha. I'm a doer. So I cook and clean and clean and clean and clean and cook and find many projects to do when I'm going through a challenging, difficult period and I'm trying to process things. But what I've learned over the years is to bring Mary into my Martha life. I'm practicing the Martha doing with the Mary being. I'm really working hard to balance my life better by giving more equal time to the doing and the being. See, my being time is usually on the back porch with a cup of tea and my devotional books and Bible, and I practice my deep breathing and I look out at God's creation and I can pray and meditate and read and enjoy being with God. And I listen. I'm able to listen to what He would have to say to me about the hard places in my life and about the times of rejoicing in my life. My time on the porch is where I run with God. What are those places for you? David spent some of his cave time crying out to God in songs. And we have the Psalms as a result. He wrote 75 of the 150, and some of these were written in his cave time. David did some singing in the cave. What a beautiful lesson for us. I want us to look at Psalm 13. In this psalm, David cries out 4 times, "How long? How long? How long? How long?" He feels alone. He's abandoned. He feels frightened and sad, and it seems as if God is just unavailable. Have you ever been there? You cry out to God, but you don't feel heard or seen, and you certainly don't hear an answer. This psalm falls into 3 stanzas with 2 verses each, and I want you to look at this method, this format that David has used. He presents a problem in verses 1 and 2, and then in the next 2 verses, he gives a petition, his plea to God, and then finally in the last 2 verses, he offers praise to God. The stanzas seem to decrease in their magnitude or turmoil as he settles down. At first, David is crying out in anguish, and then he offers a more gentle petition. And finally, he rests in the joy of knowing that God will answer him and be faithful. Let's look at Psalm 13, the problem. The problem is God. God seems distant. "Oh Lord, how long will you forget me? Forever? How long will you look the other way? How long must I struggle with anguish in my soul, with sorrow in my heart every day? How long will my enemy have the upper hand?" You see, David wrote this psalm on the run. He is in and out of caves. And he thinks God is distant in the face of an enemy that is very present. David was in the waiting period. He was holed up in a desert wilderness. And after about all he and his men could do each day was to get their daily provisions and just keep watch. The hours and the days and the weeks and the months must have dragged on as David was waiting for God to act and do the next thing. David was perhaps in his 20s at this time. This had been going on for years, and where was God? Had he forgotten David? Perhaps you can relate. When God seems distant, it always affects our emotions. David had gone from the heights of hope to the depths of despair. As God did with David, no, He will be with us in the waiting. David moves on to petition in the next 2 verses. This is his call to the Lord. Turn and answer me, O Lord my God. Restore the sparkle in my eyes, or I will die. Don't let my enemies gloat, saying, we have defeated him. Don't let them rejoice at my downfall. Immature Christians get into a fix, a bind, or a cave, and instead of turning to God, they begin to blame God. Instead of running with God, they run from God. Instead of turning to God, they turn away from God. Instead of complaining to men about God, though, David complained to God about men. David ran with God. The test of our faith is not when God's presence is real and we can feel Him, when we see God at work in our life. The real test of our faith is when we think God is in the distance. Do you seek Him then? If you seek Him, you will find Him. But if you turn to the world or look for a quick fix for the problems without seeking God, you just won't find Him. Seek God, especially when He seems so distant. David was fearing for his life. And for the Hebrews, dim eyes were a sign that the vital powers were growing dim within, and death was approaching. But bright eyes were a sign of life. So David calls out to God, enlighten my eyes. Bring back the sparkle in my eyes. Take me from the brink of death to the height of life. Do your eyes sparkle? We want them to sparkle because that's a sign of life in Christ. I want sparkling eyes, do you? If we fix our eyes on Him, we'll get the sparkle in our eyes again. And then we move to the last 2 verses, the time of praise. And this theme, trust in God's unfailing love. Verse 5, but I trust in your unfailing love. I will rejoice because you have rescued me. I will sing to the Lord because He is good to me. David has not even yet been delivered, but he is trusting in the meantime. He's trusting in the loving kindness, the unfailing love of God, and this calm assurance comes over him. His heart now is filled with joy as he thinks about God's deliverance. He's just thinking about it. It's not even happening yet. Can we get to that point where we pour out our heart to God? We are living in the hard times. We're on the run. We're in the cave. We're having a sense of despair, and we just begin to talk to God and imagine His future with us and His unfailing love. And just the thought of it brings back the sparkle. Just the thought of it gives hope. Just the thought of it makes us rejoice in God. See, that's a real test of faith, that we can rely on the trust of God in the meantime and find the joy in it before it even comes. Here's what's interesting. David's circumstances have not changed. David was still hiding in caves, and Saul was still on the run after him, trying to kill him. So what changed? David's focus changed. From focusing on himself and his problems right there in the cave, he made a shift. He began to think of God's unfailing love, God's loyalty, God's faithfulness, and his own salvation with God. He began to shift his focus. It moved him from confusion and fear and depression to joy and praise. David was in cave times. He was in a cave of emotional darkness. Maybe you've had your own cave times. Maybe you're in one now. Cave times can start when you go through a lengthy illness and the strength just never comes, and the future plans begin to fade, and so does your hope. Cave times often begin with an unanticipated job loss and subsequent growing and hopeless financial needs. Cave times happen when you've been betrayed or disappointed. Cave times commonly occur when you've had a lot of marriage and family difficulties, or when children stray from the faith. Cave times occur when through a demanding and unreasonable relationship with someone who's jealous or spiteful. Cave times can occur waiting for people to change when they just don't see anything wrong. Cave times can happen in transitional periods of life, a death, a divorce, or a marriage, or a retirement, or a move. Cave times can occur through becoming fearful and frightened by the changes in the world. Cave times usually make us feel depressed and all alone because others no longer seem supportive or as friendly. An abandoned feeling leads us into this downward spiral of thinking. We say, I just can't dig out. I'm all alone and no one cares for me. And then, like David did initially, we might also say, I feel abandoned. But David emphatically says, I trust. I trust in your unfailing love. That Hebrew word for trust is batah. The root meaning of batah means to seek refuge. Now listen, David is seeking physical refuge in a cave. He's seeking that refuge from people who are trying to kill him. And even in those circumstances, he realizes that his real refuge, his spiritual refuge, is through his faith in the everlasting God. And because he has that and he can trust, he can then rejoice and sing. In this psalm, I envision David at the beginning just hunched over, looking down and forlorn and sad and permeating. Is just permeating all of his appearance. And then he begins to share his problem, and he moves on to the petition, and his demeanor begins to change just a little bit. His focus was on self and his emotional state, but then he starts to move more towards something that seems reasonable and rational. And then his faith begins to surface, and he pours out his heart to God, and he talks himself through. And he realizes his hope is not in his cave of despair, but his hope is found in his refuge with the everlasting God. And that's when he begins to rise and he lifts up his arms in praise for the enlightened eyes where he can now see. He got his sparkle back. That famous preacher Charles Spurgeon was walking through the English countryside with a friend, and he noticed a barn with a weather vane. And at the top of the vane were these words, God is love. Spurgeon remarked that this was an inappropriate place for such a message because weather vanes are changeable, but God's love is constant. But Spurgeon's friend disagreed. He says, you misunderstand the meaning. The weather vane is stating the truth that no matter which way the wind blows, God is still love. When God seems distant, join David in deliberately trusting in God's unfailing love, however the winds of your circumstances are blowing. Oh, Father, thank you for this lesson in Psalm from David of his pleading and his crying out, and for the lesson in Samuel that David was on the run but always consulting you and always seeking your guidance. Help us to do that. Help us to learn the lessons from David about faithfulness and trusting you. Help us even today with whatever we're facing to lift our heart and our hands to you and pour out our pleas and our cares, and then help us to be faithful to rejoice and sing. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. I hope you'll be back next week when we're going to see what catches David's eye. See you then.